There's a moment in Empire Strikes Back that tells you everything about Boba Fett. Darth Vader is briefing a lineup of bounty hunters. When he moves down the line, he gets to Boba Fett. He pauses and says,
"No disintegrations."
Fett replies,
"As you wish."
He tilts his head and the scene moves on. And yet, in 1980, audiences walked out of cinemas obsessed with him. Why? He had maybe 4 lines and 6 minutes of screen time across 2 films. By any objective measure of screen presence, he should be a footnote in these movies. Instead, he became one of the most culturally enduring characters in the history of cinema. The easy answer, and it's not wrong, is the mystique, the armor, the silence, the ambiguity. When a character says and does almost nothing, our imaginations fill the gap. We project onto that helmet whatever we need to understand him. But I think the easy answer sells short something more interesting, because the story about Boba Fett since his inception isn't just about sleek design and good marketing. It's about what happens when a character conceived as pure aesthetic is handed to writers and, crucially, to an actor with something to say. This video essay is going to do 3 things. Firstly, we'll trace the behind-the-scenes history of how Boba Fett came to exist. Second, we'll move through his character development chronologically from a boy on Kamino watching his father die to the daimyo of Mos Espa. And finally, we'll analyse the character by thinking about what does Boba Fett tell us about trauma, identity, and belonging? And why does it matter who plays him? Because I'd argue the story of Boba Fett is inseparable from the man who betrays him. Let's start at the beginning. Boba Fett was not designed to be Boba Fett. He was designed to be an army. George Lucas was developing The Empire Strikes Back in 1977 and 1978. He'd established Darth Vader as the evil face of the Empire in the first movie, but he needed something new, something more mercenary. So he told his design team he wanted super troopers, an elite military force that was visually distinct from the standard stormtrooper. The original idea, according to visual effects art director Joe Johnston, was that Boba Fett was going to be an army. But when prototype armor was built from designs by Johnston and concept artist Ralph McQuarrie, producer Gary Kurtz quickly realized they couldn't afford to make that many versions of the costume. So the Super Trooper concept was shelved, but the armor was too good to waste. Eventually, it was decided that this armor would be repurposed for a new character, a bounty hunter named Boba Fett. Early test footage shows this armor was painted fully in white, with a functioning flamethrower. In time, the costume team decided to colour his armour to his now iconic look. The armour was also designed to appear to have been scavenged from multiple sources, adorned with trophies. Every dent and scratch implies a story we hadn't seen. And that's the genius of the design, as it is a biography told entirely through his costume. Now here's the detail most don't know. Boba Fett didn't debut in The Empire Strikes Back. He debuted at a county fair parade in California on the 24th of September, 1978. And then 2 months later, he appeared in what has to be one of the strangest artifacts in the history of Star Wars.
The Star Wars Holiday Special, sponsored by General Motors. People building transportation to serve people.
While most of this special focused on Life Day, buried inside of it is a 10-minute animated segment that contains Boba Fett's first on-screen appearance before his theatrical debut in The Empire Strikes Back. The rest, as they say, is history. Attack of the Clones fills the gap. I think it's important to recognise that George Lucas decided to use the prequel trilogy to show the childhood of 2 villains from the original trilogy. Obviously Boba Fett, but the main focus of the prequels is the transformation of Anakin Skywalker into Darth Vader. Whilst Anakin's story takes up the bulk of the prequels, we can see many parallels between his and Boba's story, the most obvious example being that both characters lose a parental figure in this movie. Fett is raised on Kamino, a water world, relentlessly grey and sterile, a planet whose entire purpose is industrial reproduction. He is surrounded by thousands of copies of his father, Jango. Identical bodies and identical armor, marching in identical formations, trained for a single purpose. Boba alone is different. He is the price Jango negotiated for his genetic contribution, an unaltered clone, raised as a son, a soldier, and a bounty hunter. Think about what this means for a child's sense of identity. He is simultaneously unique and redundant. He is cared for, but he lives among living evidence that his father's genetic material is a commodity. He is, in a very real sense, a property of an empire before he has the language to understand what empire is. It is worth noting too, Boba is a clone of a man who was himself a mercenary, a foundling raised on Mandalore. Jango never had the experience of a world before violence, and so for Boba, violence was the atmosphere. When Mace Windu decapitates Jango in the Geonosian arena, Boba walks across the battlefield and picks up his father's helmet. He holds it in his hands and presses his head against it. The child does not see a guardian of peace and justice protecting the innocent by being forced into killing a mercenary. A child sees a father being killed. This is the founding wound. And like all founding wounds, it doesn't just shape him, it defines his architecture of everything that comes after. What does a child learn when the first great loss of their life is an act of sudden violence? He learns that power is the only reliable currency. He learns that attachment is vulnerability, because things that you love can be taken in an instant, which coincidentally parallels the Jedi philosophy. He also learns to wear a helmet. Then we jump about 25 years into the timeline, and here is Boba Fett as most people first encountered him. In the lineup scene with bounty hunters, he says nothing, but then Vader specifically singles him out.
No disintegrations.
The implication is that in the past, he has exceeded this brief. There's a history of violence behind him that Vader finds notable. Vader, who blew up a planet in the movie before and who was actively waging a military campaign across the galaxy, and he's telling Boba Fett to show some restraint. The other crucial line comes from when Han Solo is being frozen in carbonite, and Fett asks,
What if he doesn't survive? He's worth a lot to me.
The fact he could talk to Darth Vader this way, coolly, without deference, focused entirely on the transaction, only makes the bounty hunter more impressive to audiences. In a film full of characters performing loyalty and fear, Boba Fett fears nothing and is loyal to the job. He is purely transactional. Notice also his reaction to Leia disguising herself as the bounty hunter Boushh in Return of the Jedi. When she threatens to use a thermal detonator in Jabba's palace, a move of high-stakes bluffing, at first Boba's caught off guard and pulls out his blaster. But then, after the transaction occurs, Fett soon respects the bluff, giving a polite nod, as he respects Boush's nerve. And then, as Luke and the team are breaking out of Jabba's clutches, Han Solo, blind and disoriented, accidentally hits Fett's jetpack and sends him tumbling into the Sarlacc pit. This is one of the most significant moments in the history of Boba Fett, as this is his spiritual death. There's a brief silhouette in Season 1 of The Mandalorian, a figure which approaches the body of Fennec Shand. The audience can hear the spurs, but fans were not fully convinced of the bounty hunter's return. By Season 2, the teaser's over. We see Tamora Morrison's return briefly at the end of Episode 1. However, Boba Fett makes his grand return in the episode The Tragedy. The Boba Fett we meet here is older. His face is weathered, he has no armor, just robes and a cycler rifle. He simply appears, makes his claim, while threatening the life of Grogu in the process. The armor was his father's, and it is therefore his. This is a Boba Fett who has been spiritually reborn, which is later revealed in the Book of Boba Fett. What really struck out to me was that Boba Fett makes a deal with Din Djarin. I'll protect the child in exchange for the return of my armor. And then, when Grogu was taken by the Dark Troopers, Fett honors the deal. For a character whose entire perception by the audience is built on self-interest, this is significant. Boba Fett chooses to honor a commitment when it would be easier not to, and that is not the behavior of a mercenary. From what we learn in the Book of Boba Fett, his robes, cycler rifle, and gaffy stick are all relics of his time with the Tusken Raiders. He puts his armor on, but he wears the robes of these people underneath. In the next episode, The Believer, we see Fett again, but this time with a fresh coat of paint. The Boba Fett we knew from the original trilogy with weathered armor is gone. A new Fett, repainted and wearing the robes of the Tusken Raiders, appears. This is the complete spiritual rebirth of Boba Fett, but it would take another show to completely understand the journey of this rebirth. The present day Boba Fett is operating from muscle memory. He's doing what someone in his position is supposed to do, consolidating power, managing alliances, projecting dominance. because that's the vocabulary he has. The flashback Boba Fett is learning an entirely new language, and watching someone learn is always more compelling than watching someone perform. Boba escapes the Sarlacc pit, stripped of his armor by Jawas and captured by the Tusken Raider tribe. His first instinct is to escape. He tries and fails. He's beaten, restrained, and made to work. When he and a Rodian prisoner are taken into the desert by a young Tusken child, they encounter the Sand Beast. The Rodian is killed, but Boba kills the creature using only the chain connecting him to the dead Rodian. He saves the Tusken child's life in the process. The act of saving a child he has no obligation to save, using improvised means in a desperate situation, is what opened the door for acceptance. The Tusken chieftain sees it, and slowly, through a series of exchanges, both practical and ceremonial, Boba Fett is integrated in the tribe. He's trained by an expert Tusken in how to fight with the traditional gaffy stick, and he watches the Pike Syndicate's trains assault the Tusken people with impunity, murdering the Tuskens on their own land. He then steals speeder bikes from a nearby gang. He teaches the Tuskens to ride them
like a panther.
He leads them in a raid on the train. Critically, when he confronts the Pike crew afterward, he addresses the leader of the Pike crew, asserting that they are trespassing on the lands of the Tuskens.
These people lay ancestral claim to the Dune Sea.
There it is. That is not bounty hunter talk. That is the language of rights, of recognition, of indigenous solidarity. The ceremonial initiation that follows is extraordinary in its quiet dignity. A gecko enters Boba's body and he walks into the desert alone. He finds a watchwood tree and returns with a branch, from which he forges his own gaffy stick, a symbol of belonging. That night, the tribe dance around the fire, and Boba dances with them. It is notable that whilst Fett was raised in a sterile industrial laboratory, he is reborn in nature. After Fett goes to negotiate with the Pikes and Mos Eisley, he returns to the Tusken camp to find ash and bodies. This is the second great loss in Boba Fett's life, and it mirrors the first with cruel precision. The first time, his father was killed by someone with institutional power, a Jedi, an agent of the Republic. This time, his adopted family is killed by a criminal syndicate, leveraging the same indifferent power. In both cases, Boba Fett is not there when it happens. In both cases, all he can do is hold what remains. But the response is different. The boy who held his father's empty helmet went cold. The man who buries his Tusken family performs their funeral rites. He doesn't disassociate. He doesn't pivot immediately to revenge. He grieves, in whatever Boba Fett's hardened way of grieving looks like, but he does it. And then he keeps the tradition. He dresses in the Tusken style, carries the gaffy stick, and wears the tribe's marks and wraps as he moves through to where we meet him in The Mandalorian. The Tuskens who welcomed Boba are dead, but the Boba who walks is their representative. There's something I think is foundational to understanding why Boba Fett resonates with audiences in the way he does, specifically in his post-2019 incarnation. The argument is this: the Book of Boba Fett, whether fully intentionally or through a remarkable confluence of casting, performance and storytelling instinct, is a story about Indigenous identity, land rights, and the possibility of cultural recovery after dispossession. And you cannot tell that story without Temuera Morrison. Firstly, I'd like to point you towards this amazing podcast episode from the Dom Harvey podcast where Temuera Morrison discusses his life and career. This was really informative in understanding how Morrison approaches his work and the themes surrounding his work. Temuera Morrison is a Maori man from Rotorua, New Zealand. He grew up sharing a bed with 4 other siblings. In his generation, there were 17 siblings and cousins who all learned from his auntie and uncle to play the guitar and to dance. He notes that
the culture was a big part of my upbringing.
In his early career, he worked in the government department for Maori affairs and the magistrates court, where he said he saw
all my relations come to court.
It is clear that before Morrison took the risk before becoming a professional actor, his youth and early career was deeply entrenched in Maori culture and being exposed to the consequences of colonization. Before we discuss his early work, I'd like to give you a content warning, as we will be discussing the movie Once Were Warriors, a film which deals with domestic violence, drug abuse, and other mature themes. I recommend you skip to the time on screen now if this is something you don't want to see or hear. Morrison's career-defining early role was as Jake the Muss in Once Were Warriors, the violent patriarch of a struggling suburban Auckland family. The film became the most successful local release in New Zealand at the time and earned Morrison international acclaim, critics noting the Brando-like intensity, describing it as a masterly depiction of raw, aggressive masculinity and intergenerational trauma. Jake's villainy is the product of colonization's long shadow, expressed through alcoholism, domestic violence, and a need for dominance. The film is unflinching about the harm he causes, but it is equally unflinching about where that harm comes from. Whilst he has described this role as
having that movie to open the door,
Morrison said that he felt typecast in this role, calling it a millstone around his neck. And it's easy to understand why. When your most celebrated performance is as a man who hurts women and children, even in a film that is clearly critical of that violence, Hollywood tends to see a type rather than an actor. Morrison has also mentioned how this role left a psychological impact on him and the difficulty of adjusting to other roles shortly after this film. On a positive note, Morrison shared a story where he met a woman who worked at a refuge. She told him that the film helped women identify similarities in their relationships and to call the refuge to seek help. His work subsequent to his return in Star Wars also addresses themes of recognizing indigenous cultures. Earth Oven is perhaps the most explicit expression of this lifelong project. The series follows him across continents, exploring how the Earth Oven, as a cooking method, connects indigenous peoples across cultures through relationships with land and community. In his own words,
a lot of it is not so much about the eating, but more about the sharing of culture, sharing of ideas, seeing some of the similarities.
It is a show about the universality of indigenous custodianship, about how peoples who have been marginalized, colonized, or erased by larger powers have nonetheless maintained practices and relationships with land that predate the powers that sought to erase them. It is clear that a consistent theme of Morrison's work and the texts that he appears in principally deal with indigenous cultures, how they're impacted by colonization, and the future of these cultures through tradition and celebration. Now to bring all of that back to Boba Fett. Morrison said in interviews when he was filming the book of Boba Fett,
a Maori from New Zealand, putting us on the world stage again, representing the indigenous people. So I feel a sense of responsibility.
A specific example of Morrison bringing a real-life culture to a galaxy far, far away is found during the funeral ceremonies for the Tusken tribe. He doesn't just act the scene as written. He pulled from his own culture his understanding of ceremony, of preparing warriors, and of sacred relationship to land. Temuera Morrison himself spoke about how this connected to something personal. At a Television Critics Association panel, he said he pulled from his own culture in a way, in terms of the ceremonies and preparing the warrior and preparing a weapon. He noted that Boba Fett had never experienced a real family, with the young Tuskens and the old Tuskens and protecting their land. He said those scenes gave the character something completely new. That's an actor being an author. That's an artist using the tools of a global franchise to say something that the franchise hadn't quite gotten around to saying on its own, which leads us to the depiction of the Tusken Raiders. The rehabilitation of the image of the Tusken Raiders across The Mandalorian and the Book of Boba Fett is, when you read it carefully, a direct inversion of one of Hollywood's oldest and most pernicious tropes. Within the framing of Tatooine as a world of frontier towns and space cowboys, the Sand People fit as an allegory, intentional or otherwise, for indigenous populations. For 40 years, that's essentially how Star Wars treated them. Violent, mindless obstacles defined by their danger to our main characters rather than by their own cultures or claims. The Book of Boba Fett begins to correct this, showing that Boba understood that the Tuskens had an ancestral claim to their land, and everyone else was encroaching on their rights. The name Tusken Raiders itself is revealing. In Star Wars lore, a storyline revealed that there was Fort Tusken on Tatooine, one of the very first settler compounds built by those from other planets. This fort came under constant attack or raids by indigenous tribes, and the colonizers named the indigenous people after the act of resisting colonization. And in the Book of Boba Fett, for the first time, we are asked to see it from the other side. The Book of Boba Fett challenges the audience to reconsider their views on this group after 40 years. Temuera Morrison highlighted in an interview,
we know all about that word, colonized and all that, so down here.
Once again, highlighting the bridge between this story and the actor's journey. So what does Boba Fett become through his immersion in Tusken culture? He becomes an advocate because he's been welcomed in, fed, given identity, family, and purpose. And the natural human response to this genuine belonging is loyalty. He wants to protect the thing that has given him a self. And this is the first sense of belonging he has felt since his father was taken from him on Geonosis. I believe this kind of story could not be told, or at least to its full potential, without an actor with a history as rich as Temuera Morrison's. Morrison, whether in the text itself or in interviews, has clearly influenced the story told over The Mandalorian and the Book of Boba Fett with respect to the Tusken Raiders and illustrating their way of life, cultures, customs, and practice. Now let's try to bring all these threads together, because I believe there is a universal truth at the center of this character. Boba Fett is a man who was created to serve a purpose he did not choose, whether it was his original design to be a super trooper, which was later molded into a bounty hunter, or the product of a cloning program genetically designed to be exactly in his father's image. He is the product of a system, both in-universe and in the real world, which beings are valued objectively. He is useful, therefore he exists. His father loved him, yes, but his father was also a weapon, and Boba was a copy of that weapon. When Jango died, the instrument lost its guide. Boba spends the next 2 decades throughout the Clone Wars and during the reign of the Empire in a kind of identity vacuum. He has the skills, he has the armor, he does the work, but he's not established himself as his own. The Tusken Raiders give him something he has never had, a context in which his usefulness is secondary to his belonging. They don't want Boba Fett the bounty hunter. What they want is Boba Fett the person, the one who notices a child in danger, the one who keeps his word when it costs him, the one who is willing to sit by a fire and learn a stick-fighting form from an elder who doesn't share his language. This is the insight that I think is most worth sitting with. Embracing the Tuskens culture didn't require Boba to abandon his own. It required humility and a willingness to be a student rather than an expert, and it required the recognition that his way of seeing the world is not the only legitimate way. The Boba Fett of Empire Strikes Back cannot imagine this. He's entirely self-contained. His identity is his armor, his reputation, his price. This version of Fett is an expert that is unlikely to submit to being a student. The Boba Fett of the Book of Boba Fett carries the armor, but the paint has been restored, and beneath it, he wears the robes of the Tusken Raiders and carries a gaffy stick. He carries the memories of a people. He is, in the end, 2 things at once: the product of institutional violence and the student of those who which the violence has been acted upon. And the distance between these 2 things, which is the span of his entire arc, is a kind of measure of what growth can look like for someone born into cycles of harm. Separately, the relationship with Fennec Shand deserves its own moment. She is, in many ways, the mirror Boba needs. Where Boba is trying to be something other than a hired weapon, Fennec is comfortable being entirely that. She has no ideological project, she is loyal to Boba, and genuinely loyal, but her loyalty is built on a clean transaction. He saved her life, and she owes him hers. What makes their dynamic rich is that neither of them performs warmth, and yet there is a genuine mutual respect. They understand each other because they come from the same world. Coming back to Boba Fett, there's a moment in the Book of Boba Fett where he explains his approach to leadership.
Jabba ruled with fear. I intend to rule with respect.
The crime families dismiss this. It reads as a kind of naive idealism from a man who should know better. Some fans would call this a weak Boba Fett, but I read this differently. I read this as a man who has seen what fear-based power does to a people. He's watched the Pike Syndicate run trains across the Tusken land, killing anyone who objected, because they had the weapons and the money and the indifference. He has seen a Jedi kill a father. He has watched what that kind of power leaves in its wake. He doesn't want to build that. Even if he quite can't articulate the alternative effectively enough, the instinct is real. It was given to him by a tribe of people who had survived by caring for each other in a desert that wanted them dead, whether by the Dune Sea, colonizers, or criminal syndicates. This story cannot be told without Temuera Morrison's understanding of how cultures can practice respect, care, and belonging despite subjugation, and how we should be encouraged to strive towards moving into the future, allowing ourselves to learn from the lessons of the past without letting it define our future. Boba Fett began as a solution, an army of one, a bounty hunter with borrowed armor and a mercenary code. His early power was purely aesthetic, but something interesting happened when they finally committed to telling his story fully. They cast an actor who brought with him an entire cultural inheritance about land, loss, violence, and belonging. And whether by design or by the grace of good art finding its own meaning, that inheritance shaped the character in ways the plot alone couldn't have. Boba Fett is now a character about what it costs to be made for war in a galaxy that cannot stop having one. He is a character about the people who get run over by the trains of empire. And he is a character about one man's slow, imperfect human attempt to find a self that was never given to him. Temuera Morrison is the only actor who could tell this story. The helmet hides the face, but the gaffy stick tells the story. Thank you for watching my very first video essay. I really hope you enjoyed it. Let me know your thoughts. I don't know if you agree with me or completely disagree, and do you have different takes on this character and the Tusken Raiders and how this story's evolved over time, and whether it was intentional or it was just a complete coincidence that this was told. This is my first time trying out a video essay, so I'd really like to thank Amelia for reading over my script. It was a bit of a longer one, so I appreciate her taking the time to help me refine it. But most importantly, thank you to you for sticking it through and watching this completely. I really appreciate your support, and I hope you come to stay for more, watch podcasts, watch some other videos, maybe more video essays in the future. But till then, may the podcast be with you. Bye.